Hello there, my name's Brandon and I make pictures out of tiny squares, and I'm back with another pixel art entry into my 1-bit cyborg detective boy series. As you can tell, it doesn't really have a formal name yet, but this is just a character idea I've explored in a couple previous videos, and I wanted to make a piece showing him in his home. Since he's part robotic, I thought it'd be cool to have him sitting at a workbench and inspecting some abilities and upgrades for his arm. For now, I'm started on the lower section of the drawing, which will be kind of this wider view of his apartment, filled out with random electronics and bookshelves and stuff. And then later I'm going to use the upper portion of the canvas to design kind of this interface graphic depicting the ARM upgrades. The full canvas size I'm working on here is 200 by 200 pixels, but then I've got these inner borders where the actual artwork is going to be, and those collectively occupy a space of 160 by 144 pixels. Which I selected because it's the canvas size of the original Game Boy, and that happens to be a sizing I like working in. And I feel like the combination of that low resolution with sort of the low fidelity of the 1-bit style is a pretty interesting look and presents kind of a unique challenge. So by the way, just in case you're unfamiliar with the terminology, the term 1-bit in reference to color palettes is just kind of a fancy way of saying that you're only using two colors. Most often you'll see this implemented as black and white, probably just because that's a clean and classic look, but really it can just mean any two colors. Sometimes I see a bit of confusion or misinterpretation of like the bit naming scheme when it comes to color palettes and things like that, but essentially the formula for like the number of colors in a palette by that naming scheme is just 2 to the power of n, where n is the number of bits available. So a 1-bit palette breaks out as being 2 to the power of 1, which is 2 colors. Whereas like a 2-bit palette would be 2 to the power of 2 or 4 colors, just like the original Game Boy, and kind of so on from there. I think where this gets confusing is that the term bit is also used to describe the processor of a console. So something like the original Game Boy had an 8-bit CPU, but a 2-bit color palette. And often you'll see pixel art even referred to sometimes as being 8-bit or 16-bit graphics, but that's generally referring to the CPU of that generation of gaming hardware, rather than like a color palette or any specific resolution. Anyway, I guess that's our little pixel art math lesson for today. And of course, none of these things are things that you need to adhere to when making pixel art, but I think it comes up every so often because pixel artists can be fascinated by restrictions, particularly those that tie back to certain gaming hardware. Case in point, I just mentioned a minute ago how I chose to use the Game Boy sizing in my artwork dimensions, even though I could have made it anything, really. Getting back to the artwork though, I find the main challenge with 1-bit work is just finding a way to communicate object form and detail using only 2 colors, obviously. One of the things that I pay special attention to in my style of 1-bit is just kind of making sure the line work of various objects don't overlap excessively. This way, each item can kind of be readable as its own thing, rather than having its line work kind of wash ambiguously into the line work of an adjacent thing. It often requires very deliberate choices in the sizing and the placement of objects within the scene, and just kind of the way that everything lines up. But that sort of attention to detail is something I usually have a lot of fun with. Actually, sometimes I'll draw something like a shelf or really just any sort of environmental object that has limited space, and I'll be trying to fit these small details in it, and I'll go like, oh man, I wish I had just one more pixel to fit just a bit more detail in here. And kind of have to remind myself like, oh wait, I can just resize the object slightly to make that the case. I have that power. So, it doesn't always require like meticulous planning. You can just kind of eyeball the initial sizing, and then don't be afraid to go in after and just kind of chop it around a little bit. Especially when working within a small canvas like this, if you're able to allocate, an extra pixel or two on certain objects or details, or to make things line up in kind of a tidy way, it can make a big difference. Alright, on the upper portion here, as I mentioned earlier, I wanted to do this sort of interface graphic that would provide some context for the actual thing that he might be working on at that bench. So I'm creating this sort of exploded technical diagram that'll have like a hand and a forearm and an elbow. And the challenge here was finding the right level of stylization that provides enough detail to recognize these objects as being the things that I want them to be recognized as, and robotic in some way, but also something that's still a bit simplified to kind of fit with the overall art style here. I ended up using line work mostly to create them as these sort of flat computer icons, and I thought about giving them labels like elbow, arm, hand, just to make it really obvious. But with the limited space here, I thought it'd be more fitting to dress up this little dialog box like it's a window of a computer program. So I spaced out some 4x4 lettering here and called the program augmented repair module.exe. And the joke there, of course, is that the term augmented repair module, aside from being sort of nonsensical, abbreviates to the acronym ARM, or ARM, and I love me a good acronym like that. I was thinking that his arm would be the source of some of his abilities or gadgets, just things that would be useful for being a cyborg detective. On his forearm, I added this small sort of disk drive, or kind of like a tape deck, I guess, because the idea is that it takes these small cassettes that will then enable different abilities to be used. I also added little cassette icons underneath as part of the diagram, and I think I decided they represented like a hacking or data splice type of ability, one that's a flashlight, and then another that's sort of this overdrive type ability for combat strength. So even though their readability is quite limited here, hopefully it's the kind of thing where like after you're told what it represents, it's like, oh yeah, I can kind of see that. And at the very least, just those ideas gave me some artistic direction to latch onto that actually kind of meant something to me. The final task here was to add a touch of animation to everything. The awesome thing about the 1-bit style is that animation work is generally quite simplified, because you're obviously not having to track the position of like multicolored shading and details as in a full color illustration. I started the animation for this one by focusing on making little technical components, little icons and bars moving and cycling around. For the hand here, I'm trying to animate the fingers kind of in a curling motion that brings the tip of the finger towards the viewer. In order to emphasize that we're seeing the top of the finger, I kept that part entirely white. To put this together, I basically kept looking down at my hand and trying to translate that motion on a frame-by-frame basis. And after getting the motion in a reasonable spot, I replicated that same idea of frames to the other fingers, and then kind of offset their rhythms to give this sort of cascading finger curl action. So that idea of like frame-by-frame work is kind of the bulk of the animation for this one. A lot of these little piecewise components, just kind of isolating various parts and creating one frame at a time, and then synchronizing them all together in some interesting way. Sometimes I'll just give myself a lot of pieces to work with for possibilities of animation. As long as you put each unique frame on its own layer, you then have the control to activate them however you like. For something like this elbow joint, for example, I kind of think like, hey, I wonder what this would look like if it was rotated around 1 pixel at a time. And so I'll create each of those frames, but then maybe sometimes I'll activate them all in sequence to get like a very slow or gradual rotation, or I could just decide to skip a few frames to make the motion appear faster if I wanted to. Moving down to the lower portion of the artwork here, I added a few simple environmental animations like blinking lights and that sort of stuff. But the main work of the animation here by far ended up being this little sequence of his cat moving across the room, which I really couldn't resist making. I've got cats myself, so while designing the space here, I could easily spot that nice little 4-hit combo from the cat tree to the books to the hanging light and up to the bookshelf. Mainly I went through this frame by frame, just kind of creating different crouching, jumping, and walking poses as necessary. And then a lot of those frames could just be reused for the various jumps required along that path. But I did also have to create some unique frames, obviously, for jumping down on the way back. So let's go ahead and take a look at the final artwork, and then I'll come back after because I want to wrap up with a final thought on the animation. Alright, so here is ARM.exe. Alright, so this whole animation is 96 frames total. Most of the components here actually just loop within a 24 frame cycle, and then those 24 frames are replicated out just to create enough time for that full cat animation to take place. What I wanted to highlight here though is just these examples of the environmental objects being affected by the cat's motion. So something like the light bar bouncing down by 1 or 2 pixels and shifting a little really helps convey that impact, and then you also get some sense of that object's stability as well. It's always important to look out for opportunities for exaggeration like this, just because it really helps sell the animation, and it's also way more fun to make. Let's go ahead and close out with some CRT time. I hope you enjoyed watching this get put together. So, thank you for watching, and take care and keep it square.